So I was conceived on a boat. My parents in the late 50s built a 36-foot wooden gaff rig schooner, and they built it in Washington State, but they had it shipped to Nova Scotia on a Japanese freighter, and then they drove across and met the boat, or maybe they flew, I don't recall, I wasn't born yet. And then they sailed all down the eastern seaboard, all through the Caribbean, through the canal, and then up the west coast. And my mom wanted to start a family, and my father had said not until we're through the canal. So after that, she was allowed to start trying to get pregnant, and obviously they were successful, and my conception is actually in a logbook, the coordinates, the date, everything, and we still have the logbook. And then I was born in San Francisco, and I was brought home in a mahogany banana box, which was the norm back before cardboard banana boxes. Fruit boxes were beautiful mahogany. So I had a little mahogany banana box that my dad had decorated up for me, and they brought me back to Sadie when I was 3 days old. And I had a 4-foot bunk in the bow of the boat, and that was my home from 0 to 5. And then by the time I was 5, my feet were poking into the chain locker, and so my mother said, we need a bigger boat. So that's when they set off and they sold Sadie and found Margaretta. And she was a 50-foot ketch built in Poole, England, lovely wooden boat. They spent 2 years getting her ready to be livable. And then we lived aboard her until I went off to the Maritime Academy at age 18. So I guess I'm just kind of salty from birth. I don't know if this would be enjoyable. It was certainly memorable with Singapore. And I had been flown to Singapore to catch a tanker. And when you arrive as a merchant mariner, you don't have a visa. So you are in the country only as a transitory person, and you're supposed to be met by a local official. Well, they're not an official, a local person called a ship's agent. And so the ship's agent would pick you up from the airport and then escort you to the vessel. You're not just allowed to roam free willy-nilly in this country. So I get to the airport and I see my name being held up by the agent, you know, as you get off the plane, and he looked very surprised, and I knew it was because I was a girl. And he says, I don't know what to do with you. And I said, well, I'm the second mate on this ship, take me to my ship. And he says, you're not allowed on the refinery grounds. I said, well, you better figure something out because I've got a ship waiting for me. So we get to the refinery. He hands me off to the guards at the refinery, and they look equally surprised. And they said, we don't know what to do with you. And I said, I could see the ship. And I said, I need to get to that ship. That's my ship. You know, I'm the second mate. You have to get me there. So it was decided the best course of action was to put an empty 55-gallon drum in the back of a pickup truck and cover me with burlap. This drum had not been cleaned. This is after a 12-hour flight, you know, to get to Singapore. I'm already exhausted and funky, so it really probably wasn't that bad. But yeah, they stuffed me in a 55-gallon drum, put a bunch of burlap on top of me, and smuggled me to my ship. So that was a trip. When I was in the Middle East, for example, and you're working the deck of a tanker, I couldn't speak directly to the people on the dock. I had to go through a mail. So that's pretty cumbersome and weird. You know, from someone like me, it's just not accustomed to having that be an issue at all. But I did have an occasion where I stabbed a fellow. So what had happened was I was a brand new third mate, and there was a gentleman who was an able-bodied seaman on my watch. So I was a third officer, and I had 3 unlicensed ABs on watch with me. And he was kind of grab-assing me all the time. And so finally I got sick of it, and I put him in hand steering. So normally the ship is on autopilot, and the AB would just stand there and sort of monitor the heading and magnetic compass and the dials and gauges. But I wanted his hands to have something else to do other than grab me, so I told him to go into hand steering, and we're in the middle of nowhere. There was no reason to be in hand steering other than him. And so he got pretty ticked off. So this was at night. I was a midnight to 4 watch, and I put him in hand steering, and he was mad. And I had left, and I went to the chart table, and surrounding the chart table is a shade curtain for light. And I had pulled the curtain back around me, and I'm short, so I'm leaning over the chart table, putting a fix down. And he had left the helm and slipped in behind the curtain and was pressing into me from behind. Well, it startled me, and I had this pair of dividers, and it was the old-fashioned brass dividers, and he just startled me so much, and I had them in my hand, and I swung around and I stuck them in the ribs with these dividers. I didn't mean to. It just sort of happened very fast. Well, he was wearing a white t-shirt, and I guess I'd nicked him, but there was blood, and it's like soaking through the cloth of the white t-shirt, and he looks down and sees the blood, and he just comes unglued, absolutely unglued. And he goes racing down the stairs, and I can hear him pounding on the captain's door. "Captain, Captain, wake up, it's 2 a.m. I hear the door open, and I'm thinking, oh my God, I'm fired, I'm done. And I hear him say, "The third mate stabbed me," and he's standing there with his blood. And all I could hear the captain say was, "Really? What did you do?" And he says, "Oh, I didn't do anything." The next thing that happens, of course, is the phone rings, and it's the captain. "Did you stab whatever his name was?" And I said, "Well, I guess, yes, I did, but I didn't mean to." Anyway, it all worked out, and he was let go the next port. But by the time that story made it back to the union halls, the guy had winked at me, and I had chased him down the passageway with a meat cleaver. So I let that story stand. I didn't try to refute it. I just let it stand, and I never had a problem at sea. So that's my advice to young women. So if you get a good story, run with it. Let it roll. There came a point in my seagoing career where I was staring out the window at nothing, and that's your life out there. It's just hours and hours of boredom and not a lot happening, interspersed here and there with moments of sheer terror, or humor. But most of the time, there's nothing going wrong. And you're in an open ocean. There's not a lot of marine life or wildlife to see out there. You're lucky if you get a bird, or see a whale or something, or some dolphin. So there's a lot of just boredom. And I was staring out the window. It was a lovely day. I think I was going to Guam, and I'm sure I was going to Guam. I remember the ship now. And I realized I was trading blocks of time for cash. And it just hit me so profoundly, and I said, I need to make a change and do something more stimulating, more challenging at that point. Once you get good at something, you kind of coast a little bit. There's no real cutting edge of being a ship's officer. So I called my dad. I said, "I've got all this money." I said, "I don't think I want to go to sea anymore, or at least I need a break. What should I do?" And he said, "Well, with your mouth, you should go to law school." So I did. That's what I did. Yeah, and I don't regret that at all. It was wonderful to be in a room with a lot of people that were smarter than I was and younger than I was. And I did pass the bar, so I've got everything lined up if I ever wanted to practice. And there may be a time in my life in retirement that I'd be interested in practicing. But at that age, your late 20s, early 30s, that I couldn't be in an office that much. I just couldn't do it. And then having a graduate degree of any sort opened so many doors. I wouldn't be at the Maritime Academy today as a faculty member, as a tenured full professor, if I didn't have that graduate degree. So it just opens a floodgate of opportunities of every unimaginable. You can't even imagine where a graduate degree might take you. So my husband and I, on this boat, once I retire, I think this boat really belongs in the Pacific Northwest, and it's built for that weather. This would not be a happy boat in Mexico, and, nor would we. We're cold weather people. So we're going to take the boat north and, cruise around the San Juans and maybe up to Alaska and just bounce around and fish.
I started my career really somewhat serendipitously. My dad was one of those of the generation that was a merchant marine sailor during World War II, ran away from his hometown in Butte, Montana to join the merchant marine. And so, kind of the background of, I had a maritime career somewhat, although, unfortunately my father passed away before I joined the Maritime Academy. I was born and raised here in San Francisco Bay, and my exposure to the industry was really no more than just riding around on the red and white ferries. That's what people did here in San Francisco. So when there was a story in the Oakland Tribune saying that the Maritime Academy was taking women for the first time, I said, that's kind of interesting. I was going to one of the local junior colleges, really not with any particular goal in mind. I'm sort of at the age where women's occupations were teacher, secretary, nurse. They just didn't do kind of non-traditional type of opportunities. So the fact that they were taking women, I said, that's kind of intriguing. I was in the first class of women accepted at the academy, and it was a challenge. There was no question it was a challenge. The men were not quite sure that they really wanted us there. Here at this school that had been in place for 60 years was now integrated, now taking women. And oh my gosh, what do we do with these people? Not knowing really port from starboard, bow from stern, it was just brand new to me. But I quickly kind of fell in love with it. I fell in love with the appeal, the uniqueness, sort of the idea of doing something a little bit different, of not being stuck behind a desk or standing in front of a classroom of children. And just kind of as time went on, got to be more and more excited about the industry. I will say that when I graduated from the academy, it was not with this goal that I'm going to grow up to be a ship's captain. It was, I'll go do this for a while, see if I like it. And that, suddenly 1 year turned into 2 years turned into 4. And you had the opportunity to raise your license from one level to the other, and that's what I did. I went from being a third officer to a second, to chief officer, to the opportunity that came my way of being a captain. That's what I did. And when that first captain's opportunity comes your way, this is a very small industry, and there's fewer and fewer American vessels and fewer opportunities for American officers. So that when that opportunity was offered to me, I wasn't going to say no. And the good news, bad news is that opportunity came my way, but I was also 8.5 months pregnant. And being pregnant is not an illness. It's not something that you can't manage. So you never say no. So I got approval from my doctor, I got approval from the office, and off I went. The crew treated me very well. When they found out that I had the opportunity to move up to the captain's spot, they quickly said, oh, she's Captain Mom. We're going to call her Captain Mom. And that was kind of fun. It was not in a demeaning way. It was just the embracing the fact that I was part of their group, somebody they respected, somebody they treated well. When I first sailed, going to some of the foreign ports were a challenge. I was brand new to the industry. There were no women on ships other than people like librarians or captains' wives. There were just not any women aboard. But I decided, fairly early on that if I had a choice, I was going to work for a company that I had a little more, they knew me and I knew them. So I kind of targeted and really spent most of my career working for a company called Matson Navigation Company. Their primary trade route was from the West Coast to Hawaii. So it's a 2-week trip. So every 2 weeks I was back and forth to Hawaii, so that over the years I knew all the workers, I knew all the longshoremen, I knew all the office people, and I didn't have to keep reinventing myself and proving myself over and over and over again. It was a wise choice, and one that I enjoyed all these years. But when I first sailed with Matson, we were leaving here in the port of Oakland Christmas Eve. We sailed from a dock that was just sort of on the other side of the channel here, fully loaded, headed toward Hawaii. 5 o'clock is when we sailed. And normally what happens when you leave the dock is you have an officer up on the bow standing by the anchors in case you need them. So routinely, you don't secure the anchors for sea until you've cleared the Golden Gate Bridge. That's just kind of the routine. But it was a really cold night. It was, Christmas Eve, and I think the captain, in his desire to kind of, get things wrapped up and get underway pretty quickly, told us to secure the anchors by Alcatraz, which is what we did. I'm standing up there on the bow with my radio and a couple of the sailors, and they said, secure the anchors for sea. Well, a minute later, after we had gotten everything secured for sea, and that includes It requires that you shackle the anchors, that you put extra safety things so that as you're taking a pounding sea across the bow, that these anchors don't work loose. But as we're going north of Alcatraz, which was our normal departure route, I get this call on the radio saying, "Let go the port anchor." And I'm thinking, oh my God, let go the port anchor. What does that mean? And a minute later, it's let go the starboard anchor. So the sailors and I are dashing back and forth, one side of the ship to the other, watching the anchors, getting them ready. And we kind of quickly realized that there's some problem. That while I didn't know it at the time, the engineers had lost the power plant. We had no power, which meant we had no ability to steer. We had no way to control the ship. So the captain was asking me to help stop the ship. That's what we were expected to do. But as we went north of Alcatraz, we're now drifting closer and closer to the Marin headlands. There's a big, huge rock off the, kind of at the, one of the footings of the Golden Gate Bridge. And we're getting closer and closer, and I'm kind of walking and looking at the anchors, and I'm saying, now we're down to 1,000 feet off the rock, Captain. Now it's 700 feet off the rock, Captain. Now it's 500 feet off the rock, Captain. And as I'm checking the anchors as well, I see the port anchor, the chain, pop out of the water. No anchor attached to it. Okay. Well, finally, as we get within about 100 feet of the rock, we finally kind of come to a stop. And I kind of radio up to the bridge. Okay, all secure. We seem to be moving. Well, the engineers get the plant back started again, get their generators up, and the engine's going again. And the captain says, okay, pull up the starboard anchor. Pull up the starboard anchor. And it is completely tangled with cable. I have no idea what these cables are, but it's completely tangled with cable. It's as if you took a fork and wrapped spaghetti around it. That's what it looked like. So you kind of said, okay, Captain, the anchor's got all kinds of cabling around it. Fine. Pull up the port anchor. So I pulled up the port anchor. And I had told them that I said, I think the port anchor let go. Oh no, it seems to be that not quite. So we pulled up the port anchor, only to discover, just as I had suspected, there is no port anchor attached to that chain. But we get the chain in. And finally, after a couple of hours of raising and lowering the starboard anchor, we get a tugboat alongside who's assisting us to kind of unwrap this cable from the starboard anchor. We finally, after hours and hours, now it's dark, it's like midnight by the time we're getting this done, but we get free, turn around, come back to the dock, and of course, lawyers are waiting for us everywhere because, you've had a major incident. We get permission from the Coast Guard about 2 o'clock in the morning to turn around and sail again. Well, when we get to Hawaii, more attorneys are waiting for us, and we discovered that the cable that we had wrapped around our anchor was the phone cable that connected San Francisco to Marin County. So on Christmas Eve, there was no phone service to Marin County. So needless to say, that was a little bit troubling. But the good news is that I was not the responsible party. I was just doing my job. And you don't think about all the things that could go wrong as you're watching these anchors pop out of the water and you're getting closer and closer to that rock. You don't think about the fact that you're standing at that bow, the pointy end, going to be the first thing that hits that rock. You just kind of do what you got to do, and you kind of breathe a sigh of relief that things didn't go wrong and that it was a good day, and it turned out okay. So it's kind of my career going to sea. Loved it. I miss it, but when I was sailing as captain, I had the opportunity. I was contacted by the CEO of the company, who said, "You've been doing this for a while. Now it's time for you to come ashore. We want you to come ashore and manage not just one ship, but the entire fleet." Sometimes good things come into your life, and it was right about that time that I had gotten the offer to come ashore. So I said, it's time. It's something for me to do. Did that for about 9 years, thoroughly enjoyed it. I had been there for a while, only to come to realize that, everybody in the executive suite was kind of a middle-aged white guy. And the idea of a woman kind of moving up into a senior position probably wasn't going to happen. In fact, my boss at the time pretty much said that. So I said, well, I'm leaving. I don't want to do this anymore, if that's the reality. And again, some doors close and another one opens up. And I was contacted by the president of the board of directors at the Marine Exchange, who said, we hear that you're kind of in between opportunities. You want to come to work for us? And here I am today, 15 years later, going, gosh, what do I do next? And I don't know what I do next, but
I feel so blessed that I came of age when I did, had the opportunities, took the opportunities, and found my bliss, so to speak. And it started when I was growing up in Camas, Washington. My bedroom window had a view of beautiful Mount Hood and the Columbia River Gorge and the water flowing by. And all I wanted to do was be in those mountains or on that water, and I just was waiting for that opportunity when school would be done and I would have my own life. So I graduated from high school in 1969, and I had a scholarship to the University of Puget Sound, and off I went with a goal of becoming a doctor so I could go on the ship Hope. That's what I wanted to do. I wanted to travel. I wanted to be on the water. I had a passion to be particularly on the ocean. Pursuing a medical career probably wasn't going to work out for me. I wasn't interested in the current form of the way medicine was practiced in our country. But the direction I went was to drop out of school and go see the world. And I had an opportunity through my summer earnings at the paper mill in Camas to take the last propeller flight over the pole from Vancouver, BC to London, and began hitchhiking with the goal to really go around the world. And I was hoping at some point to get to Bangladesh and help with the relief effort there, and met lovely people along the way, had some exciting experiences, but mostly really good things. But I discovered that what I really wanted when I was traveling was to get out on the water, and there really wasn't a way to do that. So when my funds ran out, aside from having gotten to Crete and crossed the English Channel and gone over to Morocco from Gibraltar, I hadn't really had the water experiences that I'd hoped to. So with my remaining money, I flew to New York, hitchhiked home, and I went to thank the one grown-up in my world who encouraged me to travel, to not worry about finishing school straight through. And she and her husband were having a beautiful Cascade 42 built. And that boat was to take them and their children off to the South Pacific. And through this and my longtime friendship with the Brooking family, I was invited. So the day we set sail from that dock, we were just about watching the well-wishers sink on the dock, saying goodbye to us as we sailed down the Columbia River and off to Astoria. My most exciting adventure at sea was probably right out of the gate from Astoria. We were on a schedule, never a good thing to be when you're going offshore or going anywhere on the water. You need to be very attentive to the weather, and being in a hurry, we just went for it, and we should have paid attention to the entire Pacific fleet coming in over the bar, the fishing fleet. They were going to hunker down, and out we went into what turned out to be 70 knots of wind and 30-foot seas, and well, you know, getting a few knockdowns, the mast in the water a couple of times. What happened was I was young, I was with my doctor, I was therefore fearless, and when the storm was over and the rainbows came out and the whales were spouting, I just fell in love with all of that power and that beauty, and just hook, line, and sinker, I was into this life, and I'm very grateful. That's been, oh my goodness, 45 years now, I think, since I took my passion for everything nautical into my life. I learned celestial navigation, I learned piloting, I learned anchoring skills. I spent a grand year at sea, and because Dr. Brooking and his wife had 8 kids who cycled in and out of crew positions on that boat, I ended up crewing for other vessels, which was quite lovely. My dream then, again, having run out of funds, was to get back to the Northwest and acquire my own boat. I had no idea how I was going to do this. And when I came back to the Northwest, I found my closest friends from that year of college that I attended involved in a communal boat building effort. And my part of it was to learn how to make sails and help build some sails for that boat. So I had the good fortune of getting a job in Seattle with a sailmaker called Franz Schottauer. And Franz and his 2 sons had a little sail loft down at Shoal in Seattle. We got the sails made, my lovely friend Erin and I, and she really doing most of the work, just a brilliantly talented person. And we sailed into Port Townsend, and I came into Point Hudson Harbor and was just astonished at its beauty after having sailed to many ports of call, and just realized it's as beautiful as it gets right here, with mountains all around and this gorgeous little harbor. And I began to feel that while I loved my friends in this communal boat and I loved the boat, that I still had the dream of having my own boat. As time went on, I decided I would just stay in Port Townsend, and in my naivete, I felt that if I started my own business as a sailmaker, that somehow that this new business would allow me to acquire a boat and outfit it and have a cruising kitty and take off ocean sailings. So I had a friend who was my business partner for a number of years, and her name was Nora Petrich, and we started the loft in '78. And for the first 2.5 years, I lived under a cutting table up here in the sail loft. The vessel I have now is a folk boat. So when one sailed into Point Hudson Harbor here, with a for sale sign on it, I knew that that was my boat. In the interim between when I started the sail loft and when I got my own boat, so I had the opportunity in 1980 to become crew on the schooner Adventurous. And that is a lovely vessel. She's 101 on deck, 130 overall, still does sail training for youth of all ages, as Mrs. B would call it. Mrs. B, Ernestine Bennett, being the gal who saw the vision and restored the adventure and the empowerment to see those young teenagers with their hands on the wheel of a vessel that large is quite an experience. My sailing now varies. I sail with friends here in the Northwest. Of the places that I've sailed, it's pretty hard for me to beat the Pacific Northwest, especially the area of Desolation Sound where the water's warm and it's so peaceful and beautiful, and there are mountains and places to hike. It's the places I feel most comfortable and safest in the world of all the places I've sailed so far are French Polynesia and British Columbia, and I'm so grateful for those opportunities. I'm so grateful for every time I could swim naked in the ocean off the boat, that I could hike around in these beautiful islands, that I could meet lovely people, that I could commune with nature and share the spiritual experience of moving with wind and water, especially when I'm on a wooden boat.
Good. even though I grew up in Minnesota and the sea was a long ways away in either direction. But for some reason, as a little girl, I was captivated by the water, and I read Treasure Island. I read books that, in my imagination, would carry me far away, and I ended up writing a poem about it that's in my collection, Sailing by Ravens. So it turns out that I never knew what made me long for the sea at such an early age. But many, many years later, after I'd actually been commercial fishing for a few years, I learned that my great-great-grandfather was an English sea captain. So, and so that helped explain it to my parents, who were wondering what had happened to me. I'd taken off for Alaska and I didn't come back. So from an early age on, I knew that I would eventually make my way out to the sea, and I did. After I graduated from a college in the Midwest, St. Olaf College, I went up to Alaska to make money for graduate school, and worked in the cannery, then got a job on a tender, and at the end of that season, we ended up buying a fishing boat. We'd fallen in love with Alaska, and we wanted to be able to stay there, and we wanted to work there. I think another one of the reasons that I ended up gravitating to the sea was I was a literature major in college, and I'd read a lot of, I read Melville, I read Moby Dick, I fell in love with Conrad, and so I wanted to see what Conrad was writing about. And it was that time in my life where I needed to experience it for myself. So that was the other reason it made sense to head out west, and in search of adventure, and we certainly found it. Running a small 33-foot gill netter and immersed in the commercial fishing fleet, it was a real education in real living. But I loved it, and I loved the sea, I loved being on the water. I fell in love with navigation, and that's really what kind of created this book. I wasn't so wild about fishing. I loved salmon, I loved eating salmon. I wasn't good at catching them. It was hard to kill a creature as beautiful as a salmon, and so when my former husband wasn't looking, if the salmon was still alive in the net, I would slip it back in. And so a lot of salmon lived to swim another day during my tenure. I still love the smell of a paper chart. In the end, the relationship didn't survive, but my love of Alaska and love of the water did. And it's interesting because I've done a little bit of writing about women's relationship with the sea and with boats. And of course, boats are always feminine. The sea is feminine. There's a lot of feminine energy out there. And yet, part of what I was struggling with in my early years of fishing was that it's a very masculine world, the fishing world. That's changing, thankfully. I'm really happy to see that I go to the Fisher Poets Gathering in Astoria every year. I've been going for 20 years. And there are more and more women running their own boats, working as deckhands without being part of a relationship, working in really important roles in the fishing industry. And I'm really, really happy to see that. I think I ended up feeling like I don't fit in the commercial fishing world, but I do fit in with the boats and the sea. And I ended up leaving fishing, but continuing to go back to Alaska. I had lots of sea time from all those 4 years of tendering. So I did sit for my license. And then I ended up, when my marriage came apart, realizing that this license would be useful. I'd bought my own boat. I bought a beautiful 36-foot wood sloop called the Micaiah, and I was living on my boat down on East Lake. And right across from me was a beautiful 65-foot schooner, and I got to know the people who were coming and going with boxes of food and get provisioning for the trip up to Alaska. And turns out this was Crusader, and it was run by a nonprofit organization called Resource Institute, which was founded by a real visionary guy named Jonathan White. Just mentioned that I have a license, and fairly soon after that, I was one of the skippers for the boat. It was a great opportunity for me to be able to use my seafaring skills with an organization that I felt really philosophically aligned with. I was lucky enough to be skippering one of those trips when we were out in Zodiacs with a whole pod of humpback whales that were doing their cooperative feeding, the bubble netting, and just some thrilling moments. I'll never forget it, especially once when we were in the little Zodiac. Jan was in the boat with me, and we looked up and we saw bubbles forming in a big circle around us. And I'll never forget the look on Jan's face, and she kind of said, "Get out of here." And I gunned the throttle, and we got out of there, and seconds later the water erupted. The whales were just below us, and so it was nice to have come full circle, to be working with writers and artists and other people who, really appreciated being able to be on a beautiful 65-foot schooner in these amazing places in Alaska. And I did a trip with Tess Gallagher, the poet, and I'd been writing poetry. I can't really call it poetry. I'd been writing in my journal for years. I always kept a journal when I was fishing, and I'd been reading poetry. And I'd maybe scribbled a few poems, but being on Crusader that weekend with Tess, listening to her talk about poetry, and her enthusiasm is so contagious, and she's so encouraging that, by the end of the weekend, I was, of course, when I wasn't at the wheel, I was, in the room with everybody else doing the exercises, and that started a lifelong friendship that continues, that I'm very grateful for. And really started me on the path of writing poetry. So it's amazing to me when I look back on this young girl leaving for Alaska just on a whim, on a search for adventure, how everything did eventually come together. The English, the degree in English, was eventually became writing. And I lived on my own boat, my own little sailboat, beautiful 36-foot sloop for 3 or 4 years, because that's what I knew, and it was easier for me to run a boat than a house. But eventually I bought a old 1930s log cabin in Indianola. The great thing about Indianola is that, the sea is just down the street. I can 10-minute walk and I'm down at the beach. And I was teaching in Edmonds, and so every day for most of my teaching career, I was on the water. I was taking the ferry back and forth. So, I feel like I've managed to keep that connection to the water. I think when you're working with people and your life is on the line, you develop a sense of trust that you don't in your day-to-day life on shore.
My first boat was a little 14-foot fiberglass sloop, but the story starts long before that. Mother and I rode from Oklahoma to the Pacific Ocean on a Greyhound bus. We came down the hill on Pico Boulevard and hit the big dip that's there, which unweights you a little bit and is quite a thrill. But from that moment, my fate was sealed. I fell in love with the Pacific Ocean that very instant, because there she lay, all sparkly and beautiful, and so I spent the next several years of summers letting the waves knock me down and getting back up again. After about 3 months of shopping bulletin boards, classified ads, I finally found this little fiberglass sloop. I joined a sailing club. Very good for me because they also taught, and that's where I met the man who became my boat partner. We actually had an attorney draw up a partnership agreement for owning the boat. Unfortunately, my partner thought we would never use this. I naively thought this would make it an amicable separation and everything would go cleanly and everybody would say bye-bye, good luck. Poor man spent 5 years on the psychiatrist's couch because I think he felt he had failed. It should have been the way I planned it. It should have gone cleanly and smoothly, and well, it didn't. I realized that I would have to make some adjustments in my time and efforts. That's all doable. After several months, I took a woman on as a crew to go from Panama to, let's see, where were we going? We were going to French Polynesia. But she was an excellent navigator. She was reliable on watch. You could depend on her to keep her watch, and all in all, I have to say, she was the best crew I ever had. Women, unfortunately, have been for so long told that they couldn't do this and they couldn't do that because they were female. This makes sense. And the thing that really gets to me is we bought it. We bought it. How dumb. Fortunately, I was raised by parents who didn't teach me to be afraid of things, didn't teach me that being female was a handicap. I got the good stepfather. He was great. I learned so much from him. Mother was a Missouri farm girl. I ended up spending 8 months in New Zealand because by then poor boat needed a lot of help. Yeah, well, after 8 months, I left and went to Fiji. I ended up staying almost 2 years in Fiji and Lami. Lami was the name of the little community. From Vanuatu, then it was time to head for the Indian Ocean because I was going west. Now I was in the Indian Ocean. That's always an iffy, scary place because, well, first I had to cross the Bay of Bengal, which is infamous for its storms because storms make up in the bay, it's a big, deep bay. By then, I think by then the engine had quit. It hadn't really quit. It would run for about 10 minutes and then it would overheat. All you could do was turn it off and let it cool. Of course, the wind had died. So all I had to go on was whatever the current would do. Half afraid that the wind would blow and half afraid that it wouldn't, and night would come and the freighters would come and all night I was dodging traffic. It was daylight and I'm still drifting, but I was in radio contact with friends who were in Sri Lanka now. By that evening, I had managed to work my way up to the entrance to Gaul. And so my friends were going to risk it and come out in their dinghy and help me in. I ran the engine 10 minutes, and that gave me enough power to go ahead and coast the rest of the way in. And so I told him, I said, okay, the only thing I don't have on this boat is brakes. You got to stand by to catch me, because once I get in there, and I can get in there, but once in there, I can't stop. I made the turn into the entrance, and they got me all tied up and settled down, and it was very successful. It was an experience that I wouldn't trade for anything, any part of it. I mostly, I think anybody who's gone on a long voyage like that would have to say that the most enjoyable and most impressive thing about the whole deal is the people you meet, and the lives you touch, and the lives that touch you. It's I learned so much about other people and their customs. It made me appreciate my own country more. It made me appreciate other countries more as well, because I met such wonderful people and found that we are more alike than we are different.